Stream allowance for a gemologist. Todd, let's begin with gemologist. You brought him back as a 3-year-old in this Gulfstream 1-mile allowance race. For our audience, he is number 1. Talk to us about this performance, if you would.
Well, it was a very straightforward effort, really. We talked in the paddock prior to the race. I talked to Javier a little bit about if the opportunity presented itself where he could sit off the pace and maybe get an opportunity to get a little dirt in his face and educate him, you know, that we would that would be plan A, and plan B was, you know, Javier to call an audible if necessary and ride the race as it unfolded. And the way that he broke was so alertly, he was quickly in front. The first quarter was pretty soft, so there was no other choice other than to just kind of allow him to get into his comfort zone. And you know, I love the way he did it. I love the way he finished up. You know, he came to the wire with something left and his ears pricked, and it was sort of that perfect comeback race where I thought we got enough out of it and we got a good gallop out that it, you know, set us up really well to come back in the wood back in 22 days.
At this point, Todd, in mid-March, he was still in need, at least it appeared he was in need, of graded stakes earnings. So why did he come back in an allowance?
Well, we'd kind of narrowed it down to him being ready the weekend of March 17th. We had flirted with the idea of the Tampa Derby on March 10th, but felt like we were a breeze away from being really ready for that. So the original plan was to go to Oaklawn for the Rebel. As we got closer to that, a couple things came into play. One, the allowance race became an option. Wasn't originally there, came up as an extra, and so we started looking at that. And the other thing was just the travel arrangements to get to Hot Springs from Palmettos were going to include a van ride to Ocala and then a flight from Ocala to Hot Springs. And then unfortunately there was no return flight, so it would have included a 24-hour van ride back to Palmettos. So all of that was sort of unattractive, and when the allowance race became an option, we discussed the risk of possibly leaving ourselves in a predicament graded earnings-wise if we didn't run really well in our final prep, but decided that it was worth the risk and, you know, took a shot, and then fortunately it worked out well.
Todd, he appears to be a pretty good-sized colt. Take a moment to describe him physically for our audience and tell us, how has he changed from 2 to 3?
Well, he's always been a good-sized colt, and he hasn't actually grown a lot in height from his 2-year-old to 3-year-old year, but he's about 16'3". He's a big horse that's really well balanced, and you know, he looks big in some ways, but when you stand back and look at him, he's really well proportioned. He's got a terrific, keen, sharp eye, and you know, he's a real beautiful horse to look at, and he's got a really great disposition to go along with it. He's really a pleasure to train. He's straightforward. He's very professional in everything he does. He has no bad habits. He's focused in his gallops, but not overly aggressive. So he's been a pleasure to train and a very straightforward horse for us, really, since he first came into us last summer at Saratoga.
That's wonderful. 3 weeks after the allowance race, you came north for the Wood Memorial. And for our audience, he is number 6 in here. Todd, broke very sharply, got himself a good position. Talk about this performance, please.
Well, the plan was, what we felt like was going to happen on paper anyways, was the lumber guy would be the pace setter and we would try to fall into a stalking position. It took a little while for that to unfold because our horse broke great and the lumber guy broke outward a bit, and by the time he got corrected, you know, they'd almost gone to the first turn before the lumber guy was able to make the lead and we were able to get in the position we wanted, and they sort of fanned out in the turn, kicked us out pretty wide going into the first turn, but even though we were wide, we were in the clear and getting a smooth trip, and at the same time, Alpha was saving ground on the rail, but then had to steady. So I thought it was interesting that the first two finishers probably had the most trouble going around the first turn. But he settled into a nice rhythm from that point on and got into a good, comfortable stride down the backside, and basically it was just a matter of waiting for Javier to pull the trigger. And it looked like when he made the lead in mid-stretch that he idled a bit, and he kind of pricked his ears, and he was waiting on competition, and it looked like Alpha had a lot of momentum and was revving up next to him and had a big opportunity to go by him. And I think once Jamalogist was able to see him and re-engage, he found more and finished up strongly and galloped out past the wire very well also.
Now, Todd, because he was coming back in only 3 weeks, and he was coming off just a single start at 3, how fit, how tight was he for the Wood?
I think he was probably 85-90%. We had the 1 mile race with what I thought was a good finish and a good gallop out, and then we had one very good 5 furlong breeze 6 days prior to the Wood. So his training was consistent. I felt like it was right where you would want to be for his second start of the season, and one that put him in a position to perform well in the Wood, while hopefully still room for improvement, in the next one. So couldn't be more pleased with the way it worked out, and so far, knock on wood, couldn't be more pleased with the way he's been training since the Wood.
Actually, this question is for both colts. The decision to stay at Palm Meadows, the relative quiet of South Florida, versus getting him to Churchill early and training over that strip. Talk about that.
Well, it's something that I thought a lot about, and the more I looked at it, I couldn't come up with a lot of positives to being at Churchill during the month of April. I think the weather pattern's inconsistent. You get large fluctuations in the temperature. You often get rain, which we saw almost the entire time we were there last year. I felt like Palm Meadows, both horses had been training very well here. We had a very successful meet at Gulfstream training at Palm Meadows. We also had success shipping horses from Palm Meadows to the fairgrounds, to Aqueduct, to other places, and had them run well off of this surface onto other surfaces. And, when you look back at the last 10 runnings of the Kentucky Derby, 2 horses did not breeze there at all. Two winners of the Kentucky Derby being Funnyside and Giacomo. And Big Brown did have one work there, but I think it was a quarter-mile blowout on Thursday prior where he galloped out 3/8 and 36 and change. So he was one of the last horses to arrive for the Derby at Churchill. So to me, basically, 3 of your last 10 winners didn't train hardly at all at Churchill. And in Jamalogist's case, we know he likes the surface. He's 2 for 2 there, and El Padrino ran well at the fairgrounds after shipping in from Palm Meadows. So we just felt like that this was the highest percentage play. We felt like, and so far the weather has cooperated really well. It's been pleasant temperatures, and with the exception of last week when we had to move the works up a day because of some rain, it's been perfect, and so far I'm hoping it's the right decision.
All right, let's move to your other Derby starter, El Padrino. Here is the Florida Derby. For our audience, he is number 8. Todd, talk about this. How disappointing to you was this, flat, one-paced 4th in here?
I was disappointed because I think, if you'd have told me that Take Charge Indy, who we had beaten in an allowance race here, was going to win and we were going to be 4th, just felt like, that we were a little stronger than Take Charge Indy going in and based on the strength of the allowance race. But the way the race unfolded, I think we took El Padrino out of his natural running style a bit by trying to keep Union Rags in a compromised position, which I think that's what you're supposed to do strategically when you're in a situation like that, and there's clearly one horse that you feel like is the one to beat, and if you have him sort of hemmed up in a position where you can keep him in there, that's what you're supposed to do. But I think at the same time, while we were doing that, it took El Padrino out of his game, and he would have been closer to the pace and moved forward sooner had we just ignored Union Rags being in there. At the same time, we were pretty wide on both turns, and I think it was a better effort than it looked. Speed was holding up that day, and he sort of finished, a bit one-paced. But I think since then he's made some improvement in his training, and I would expect him to run back to his best race next time.
Todd, a bit unusual with El Padrino in this respect. The last 3 races he's had over dry tracks, the Remsen last year, the Risen Star, and the Florida Derby, were all slow-paced races. A, is that meaningful at all? And B, how do you think the much quicker pace in the Kentucky Derby is going to impact him?
I think he's going to greatly appreciate it. I think he'd like to settle back a little further than he has been able to in most of his races, just because of the slow pace scenarios. So I think he'll appreciate that a lot, and I think the mile and a quarter he's going to appreciate also. So I think both of those things should allow him to perform his best on Derby Day.
Now, our audience is about to take a look at a little piece of his January 29th allowance victory at Gulfstream. For our audience, he is number 2. He is about to move up on the fence and go after Take Charge Indy. Todd, is El Padrino appreciably better on wet racetracks?
I honestly don't think he's that much better on the mud. I think the fact that he likes it, and you'll have a lot of horses that maybe don't like it, would increase his chances. But he does appreciate a wet track. I don't feel like he has to have a fast track in order to be effective, and we saw him run very well in the Risen Star on a fast track. But we certainly wouldn't object to an off track for him at Churchill. He's proven twice now on 2 different surfaces at Gulfstream and Belmont that he likes it wet, and the little bit of training that we've seen him do on a wet track, he does like it.
It's interesting. On last week's show, I mentioned to the audience concerning Bodemeister and Secret Circle that Rafael Bejarano may be the odd man out here, and that, in my opinion, he's one of the most underrated riders in North America. You have reached out to Rafael Bejarano to ride El Padrino. Talk about that choice. Well,
Rafael, we agree with you that he's one of the best riders in the country. He's consistently one of the leading riders in the country in money won and races won, and we've had a lot of success with him in the past when he rode on the East Coast and in the Midwest when we were able to use him at Churchill. So we've had good results with him in the past. I think he's a good, proactive, energetic rider, and El Padrino is a horse that probably appreciates someone that's a little more energetic than, say, a sit-still type rider.
2 more questions before we let you go. Your thoughts overall on the quality of this 3-year-old crop at this point?
Well, I think it's an exceptional crop. It certainly seems like Union Rags, champion 2-year-old and Hansen coming back and performing well, and Gemologist undefeated, Bodemeister being very impressive, Creative Cause has been good. I think the California horses are solid. I think it's a very deep crop that you're going to see 10 or 12 horses coming into the Derby off really solid final preps.
But is there a horse or a couple of horses that you fear the most? Is there a horse that you have to beat to win the Kentucky Derby next Saturday?
I don't know that there's only one. I certainly would greatly respect Bodemeister's last race, and if he's able to duplicate that, he could be very difficult to handle. I think Union Rags will rebound with a much stronger race than his Florida Derby. Those 2 would be the ones that I would identify as the ones you most likely have to beat. But it's such a deep crop that I think it's one of those. If you look up Sunday morning and see that one of 12 horses wouldn't surprise you, I'd say.
Todd, as always, thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for having joined us this morning on Down the Stretch, and all the best next Saturday with Gemologist and El Padrino in trying to win your second Derby.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Todd Pletcher, ladies and gentlemen, the conditioner of the unbeaten gemologist as well as El Padrino.